Hi, I'm Cori Wong, and for this Thing for a Change video, I have a special guest, a new friend who I just met the other night.
My name is John Akita Harold. I spent some time working in different fields that dealt with sexual violence and prevention.
You're really interested in notions of sexuality and the things that we learn about sexuality, especially from pornography.
So the reason why I think pornography is incredibly relevant is because the ways in which we're learning about sex is largely left up to pornography because our sexual education system in schools is really failing. You get abstinence only, or you get kind of like the biological, like this is physically what's going on.
Right, learning about what your uterus does.
Exactly. And in good programs, you get like the slap a condom on speech. So you get STD prevention. But I think that we really owe ourselves much more than that. And so where we tend to look for that, and I don't think it's intentional, I think it's just the default, and what happens is we look to pornography, and especially young men.
Right.
I don't think that that's inherently problematic in and of itself, but I think it's what is viewed as mainstream pornography and really gets absorbed and really becomes like the basis for understanding sexuality. That's when a really dominant message about how things should be and how you should relate to your partner, that's when it can become problematic, and I think it really directly ties into the high rates of sexual violence that we see.
There's like a standard narrative that happens in most porn, where if it's a decent enough one in terms of education, there'd be some semblance of foreplay, maybe some kind of oral sex, and then it goes into intercourse, and then the cum shot.
You gotta throw that in there. I think most people are probably relatively familiar with what mainstream porn is.
Maybe. I think that a lot of women don't, though, because a lot of women don't look to porn. Part of that might be because it's not especially made for women. Nevertheless, I think that if women were to, then the message that they would be seeing is something very narrow in terms of what a woman is to do in a sexual encounter.
Totally. Like, we're talking like heteronormative, so you're seeing
Very,
one man, one woman. There's two folks involved.
Sometimes.
And then sometimes that's true.
The lesbian representation is with men, for men, too, and that's usually just straight girls, like, faking lesbian sex.
And then it's like phallocentric. It's all about the dick, right? It's really a fascinating thing because, like, straight dudes, if our desires are fueling the drive for what porn looks like, apparently straight dudes, we really like to see dick a lot. We really like to hone in on the dick. So that's another element maybe of mainstream porn in the ways that it's oriented really towards a straight male, I would even argue white audience.
So what's the problem, then, with porn?
My main, I guess, issue with pornography is the ways in which it's become instructive to young people about sexuality and how that directly folds into a rape-supportive culture and leads to, like, high rates of sexual violence. Where I want to go with it is to start really examining how we can incorporate consent into pornography. Because I don't think that pornography as a form of media is going anywhere. It's just so ubiquitous. It's so ever-present. A 13-year-old can pull out their smartphone and, like, watch porn. I want to see some porn that's introducing consent into kind of the narrative and into the interplay between the people involved in porn. Porn has become instructive in the ways that we learn about and understand sexuality, especially for young men, especially for young straight men, and can be really problematic for us and for our partners, for sure. I think of porn as the classroom. What I would be curious in doing is entering texts into that classroom that show an alternative narrative that are talking about consent. And I know this is really contentious because some people think that pornography as an institution is inherently oppressive and problematic. And I think there's a lot of validity to that argument. But at this point, I'm more oriented towards like a pragmatic approach. I don't feel like folks who are problematizing pornography taking the route of saying like we gotta shut down porn. I just don't see that as being viable. I'd rather mess with porn. I'd rather be porn at its own game.
You want to, like, queer porn.
Totally.
So I'm all for it, but if you were to introduce alternative text into this porn classroom, the intention is clear, but at the same time, if people aren't interested in seeing that because they're, like, sitting at their computer ready to see a specific thing that they can Google and filter the videos according to their preferences, then that would be still problematic if it's catering to people's problematic preferences for things like some form of violence or domination. In terms of consent, I mean, if we're talking, like, explicitly, like, rape stuff, then that would be where, okay, we should have some more videos that have consent. But in a lot of ways, I think that plenty of videos don't make it seem like it's not consensual.
Yeah, that's a really good point to bring up. And I think it really lies on this foundation that we really, as a culture, don't understand what consent is and what it actually means. A lot of times, I think we think that consent means the absence of a no. And so you assume you have, like, the green light with your partner until your partner tells you otherwise. So, like, if I'm with someone and I'm, like, making out with them and I start to, like, feel them up, if they don't bat my hand away, then I take that as them giving me permission and consent to continue, which is fundamentally flawed. Harry Broad, philosopher dude out of Omaha or something maybe.
Omaha.
But he put out a documentary called Asking for It, and it's awesome. And what he says is you have to assume that the default is that you have a red light with your partner.
Right.
And in order to obtain a green light, they have to give you that green light. And that's what consent is. It's not assuming you have a green light until they give you a red. I think we're really in that first paradigm where we assume consent a lot of times until we're told otherwise.
Yeah.
And so I think a lot of pornography is not seen as like rape porn, even outside the genre of like rape porn. But I just don't really see them demonstrating consent in the ways that I want to really promote this idea of consent.
Going with the instructional aspect of porn, there could be a lot of really good stuff of queering porn more in terms of the content, making it instructive. So we see there's other things you can do, other ways to touch, other parts to use. It's strange because like maybe they're videos made specifically for often white straight males that are dick-centered. They love to see their own dick or imagine that it's theirs.
Yeah.
But then in terms of women's pleasure, it's also strange because it's as if it's for women's pleasure, but at the same time, it's not really substantially woman pleasure focused. There's like this facade that it's for women, but the things that are being represented are more just like she's loving it rather than what else could be done to have really good sex.
Totally. That's like a great point. And like I can't speak for conventional femininity, but I would be very curious to hear about people's experiences and how like mainstream pornography has shaped their experiences as young women too. Because seeing those representations too is equally as just like false as seeing like the dudes. Like potentially even worse because you're in mainstream pornography, women are made to be submissive, are made to be dominated, and are made to be like the object of aggression from other men.
One of the concerns that I have about it is that it's a really contentious point for feminism if what women see is representative also of their pleasure. So like if in a lot of porn women are degraded, humiliated, dominated, or submissive, then that can create this true, real felt experience for women where that is what they want, to be dominated, submissive, sometimes humiliated. This is super risky territory to go down because if you're talking about a rape supportive culture, not understanding what that consent really looks like, and then you have women who are like, but I actually do want to be dominated. That like turns me on a little bit. That like, see, uncomfy.
Right.
People can get uncomfortable with that whole idea, and I think I'm a proponent of saying like I think that it's true that porn as an industry can shape our preferences, and our preferences can shape the porn that people consume.
Totally.
So that in of itself is a pretty cohesive system, hence that's why it works so well. But the problem for a kind of political stance would be what does that imply in terms of rape supportive culture or in terms of problematic pleasures? Now, that would basically be me calling all the ladies out who might actually want to be dominated, humiliated, and submissive. Not to say that you can't have your own pleasure. And I think it's more important and probably empowering to realize that that pleasure might have come from somewhere else. That it's not just a biological thing that women love to be dominated. But physiologically, if someone's getting turned on by this sense of domination, that is somehow constructed in a larger cultural context that eroticizes that kind of power difference. And then you can get to a really scary place where the power difference is like legitimate and then exercised. All in the name of sexual pleasure, not in the name of power.
Totally. I really like how you pointed out that this is like really sketchy territory. It's contentious and it's divisive to talk about pornography. It's a really interesting kind of point of intersection between like a puritanical sexual culture that we live in and then also like the rape supportive culture stuff going on, but then also just like people's own sexual selves wanting to be expressed. And I think the move that we really have to be careful in making when being critical of porn, not demonizing and not pointing our fingers down at folks who incorporate power into their sexual practice, right?
Yeah,
and I think people are hip to that.
Well, and for the most part, that's what gets so weird about it because like I think we're definitely at a place if we're not going to be Puritans about what is proper good sex. And the counter to that, I think, is that everybody's like, well, these are my own pleasures. I can do whatever I want. That's kind of like two very extreme ends of a spectrum to say, well, everybody can just exercise their own pleasures and we're not going to police like what you can do in the privacy of your own bedroom is, I think, an important thing to do, but also with qualification. Putting some sort of political light on that is not to say you can't do it. I think more importantly, I think there should be a consciousness about where that comes from and what that can lead to so that it becomes more self-reflective so that if someone says, I love being dominated, BDSM is a thing, and so I'm not going to say you can't be into any of this bondage or domination, but people who are in a BDSM community, I think, are often more aware of what they're doing and why they're doing it in a way that can be informed then with a little bit more political safety nets of like, this is what it means to have consent. This is what we're doing.
Totally.
why we're doing it, and the communication becomes extremely important in any kind of play like that, where you have safe words, where you know you're going into something with intention.
I love a couple things you said there. I really like how you pointed to like BDSM as actually potential models for how we can learn to communicate with sex. Because that stuff requires an enormous amount of communication, and in a lot of those instances has the potential to be really, really consensual because of the strong communication, even with the power interlaced into the relationship, you know? And then the other thing, so we were talking about how our desires are kind of constructed within a social and cultural context, and what we like, any of our preferences, whether it's like food or what we're into, or like
Anal loves tomatoes.
Anal loves tomatoes, you know? Some part of what we like, and I think a large part of what we like, is kind of socially constructed, is what we're taught we're supposed to like, you know?
Right.
But then there is this element of choice in here. And that kind of goes on to some of the work that you're doing, is talking about ways in which we can learn to like tomatoes.
In general, the idea of choice and cultivating new pleasures, that's a major theme, which I think also the BDSM community really highlights, because in a way it's queer, because it's doing something non-normative, and it's an example of how different things, toys, props, dynamics, scenarios, different kinds of things can be erotic, and that can be sexually intense and very pleasurable for people that don't fit into sex's penis and vagina for an extended period of time until you do the cum shot. So sex can be blown up. When you say queering porn, or I said that for you and you agreed, I think queering heterosexual sex is a really important thing to just say, what are we thinking about sex? Sex is so narrow when it could be so much more expansive, which could be beneficial for different kinds of relationships, different kinds of encounters. One easy plug here of why that's important is disability studies. If someone is feeling I'm a sexual person, just because I have a disability does not take that away from me. Anybody else who doesn't understand that might look to them and say, you're not a sexual person. But just so you know, like, people with disabilities still have sex. A lot of people have sex, but the sex that we think that they are having doesn't fit a certain kind of framework that we've been culturally taught to assume that's what sex means. And so I think it could be really beneficial for lots of different people in lots of different communities if we worked socially to expand our notions of sex generally.
The hook for this type of work, like you said, queer sexuality, is that it's dope. And it's in your best interest to do so.
I was hoping you were going to go there. Yeah, for sure. That's what I say with the whole anal loves tomatoes when I talk about heterosexual male anal eroticism. It's like, this is in your interest. Because this is something that could feel really good. This is something that you would like. If you could choose to like other things, why would you not want to do that?
Right. And it's this like wonderful little strategic move I would always pull when I go talk to like dudes in fraternities, right, about like rape prevention stuff. Because as straight men, we're socialized to talk about sex in a very, I think, like stupid way. Like we like boast, like, oh, I banged some chicks last night. But really this mindset that you're supposed to be all about sex, and so playing off that and really leveraging that. And it's like, if you guys are all about sex and you want to have good sex, let's talk about this type of stuff. And then it gets people into it because it is in their best interest. And that's really just coming from this paradigm of trying to use privilege to work with privileged groups to minimize dominance. So it doesn't apply to all things.
I had a side thought, and I was wondering, why might straight men be especially resistant to talking about things like consent? And the thought that I had was that maybe there's a resistance to this because maybe there's a cloud of insecurity around male sexuality.
No.
And if you actually say, do you like this? That means I'm not the most dominant sex king in the room. Maybe it's a lack of education, a lack of knowledge. Maybe you're not a good sex god.
Right. Yeah, I think that's fascinating. I think what you're pointing to, what I'm thinking of, is really the fragility of straight masculinity. We're so afraid of being found out, and that really inhibits us as like just our full potential for human beings. And not to like centralize the experience of like straight men, but I think what you're pointing to is totally spot on. Is that there is like a rug to be pulled out. It's like a glass building, you know, it's easily shatterable. And no one wants to be found out. And I think having these conversations threatens that, you know?
Something that has to be so vehemently defended, represented over and over again through various kinds of cultural iterations, that this is heterosexual male sexuality, this is how you are a sex god. To have to constantly say that all the time is like, maybe
what's going on?
Yeah,
totally.
If it were just the case that was just what it is, then like you could back off, you know?
Yeah, you'd be confident.
Yeah, you don't have to be so hyper paranoid and defensive.
You'd have a feeling of robustness. But it is weird though. This happens a lot in my conversations, and I don't know if it's a good thing or bad thing, but the conversations do sometimes turn to like straight men. I think that there's a time and place for that, but is the discourse around straight men dominating the discourse on sexuality and pornography?
I think that a lot of the conversations probably become seemingly centered on straight male heterosexuality because it's so problematic.
It's a problem. Totally. Right.
Like, I think it's a well-deserved focus. The more interesting thing then would be like how to engage straight dudes
Mm-hmm.
in those conversations in a way that they won't feel so hyper defensive that they're not going to shut it out, but actually be interested in having the conversation.
Totally. Cool. Sounds awesome.
Thanks, John, for joining me for this video.
Yeah, thank you so much, Cori, for having me.
Want to know more? You can check out my website at CoriWong.com. You can also find me on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram.
You can find me. I live in Fort Collins right now. No internet presence. I'm the stranger that's like, hey, you want to talk about porn?
Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. By the way, yesterday I was at a coffee shop, and this guy was sitting next to me, and I just kept like looking over at him, and he had his phone screen on the table. He was just looking at boobs for such a long time. Long enough for me to be able to take a picture and be like, this guy's just looking at boobs.
Just
totally
enjoying
weird.
the latte, checking out some tits.
It was
like,
really strange.
Great Sunday. What we're going to see next is people bringing porn out from the seedy porn theaters and the adult book ranch down the road here.
He just revealed this secret. I live next to a porn shop.
It's pretty seedy around here. Porn, I think, is really this untapped arena. Because it's so socially taboo, we're unwilling to fuck with it.
I love puns.
That's cool.